Hello, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual iteration of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we have joining us DW Gibson discussing his new book, 1 Week to Change the World, an oral history of the 1999 WTO protests. It is published by Simon & Schuster and arrives to us on the 25th year commemorating the protests in Seattle intended to shut down the World Trade Organization's conference. Over 50,000 people converged on Seattle to send a message that working class people would not quietly accept the runaway economic globalization that threatened their livelihoods. This new book pieces together a complex and compelling account of what transpired. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Numerous dialects of their language have been spoken along this peninsula. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. In 1 Week to Change the World, the award-winning journalist DW Gibson has brought together more than 100 original interviews with protesters, police, politicians, anarchists, activists, artists, union members, and many, many others, reconstructing the events that were to take place in that historic week in late 1999. The book documents its antecedents and aftermath and shows how so many of the themes that emerged during WTO protests remain just as pressing today, including the vitalness and difficulty of grassroots activism, the aspirations and limitations of globalization, the militarization of policing, the sensationalization, the sensational nature of the media's approach, and of course, the undeniable power of the people. DW Gibson is an award-winning author and journalist. His most recent book is 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall. His previous books include the award-winning The Edge Becomes the Center, An Oral History of Gentrification in the 21st Century, and the book Not Working. He shares a National Magazine Award for his work on This is the Story of One Block in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, for New York Magazine. His writing has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, amongst others. He serves as director of Art OMI and co-founded Sangam House, a writer's residency in India. Joining DW Gibson tonight in conversation will be Celia Alario, Four Waters, and David Solnit. Celia Alario is a communication strategist, media coach, and facilitator working at the intersection of campaigning, grassroots organizing, media, and marketing. She was a field producer on Michael Moore's Emmy-nominated television show, The Awful Truth, and produced and has hosted news programming at Pacifica Radio's KPFA in Berkeley and KZMU in Utah. Also joining us tonight is Four Waters, a lifelong activist and political consultant. Four Waters spent several years as chair of a PAC, which supported Democratic organizers in rural communities. She has served for 8 years under California Democratic Party Chair John Burton as special projects consultant, where she developed and helped to implement a statewide strategic training program. Also joining us tonight is David Solnit, co-founder and also was a core organizer with the Direct Action Network and the organizing that shut down the WTO conference 25 years ago. David is also part of the Shut Down WTO Organizers History Project. We are going to post a link for that for you to look at. City Lights had the great honor of publishing his book, Globalized Liberation, How to Uproot the System and Build a Better World. He is also the author of the story of the Battle of Seattle, published by AK Press. David's also an artist, carpenter, and arts puppeteer. Join us now in giving a warm welcome to DW Gibson, Celia Alario, Four Waters, and David Solnit. It's great to have you all with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. I will kick us off. I'm so grateful to Celia and Four Waters and David for being here. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's going to be a real pleasure to talk about this book. I want to give a little bit of background here that I think is very important. I think first and foremost, it's very important to understand that of the four individuals involved in this conversation, I am the only one who was not, in fact, in Seattle in 1999. And I think that that fact is what drove me to do this book. I was 21 years old when Seattle happened, and it was an obscure headline that I didn't quite understand fully. And I think it's always sort of bounced around in the back of my head as I've spent my career thinking about labor and democracy and the challenges that we all face when we wake up in the morning and put on our clothes and start our day. And it felt like all of the things that, all of those issues that I feel are important were sort of wrapped up into the WTO protests, and I really wanted to understand them more fully. So I spent a couple of years talking to over 100 people that were involved in the protest in one way or another. Those were involved in the organizing, city officials, all levels of law enforcement, small business owners, people just in the city when it happened, all kinds of perspectives that would help me paint the most rounded picture of the events that I possibly could paint. And it would not be possible. It's really important to point out that this is, in fact, an oral history. The book is a chorus of voices. The book would not exist if everyone I asked to speak with me didn't agree to do so, if they hadn't agreed to do so. And so I'm so humbled and so grateful to everyone who gave me their time and their perspective and their emotional content to tell this story. I'm so grateful, and particularly to Celia Forwaters and David here tonight, who brought so much richness to this story, and I'm really excited to talk about it with them. So what I want to do to set the stage, because I realize we might all be coming to this conversation with different levels of familiarity with the action, I want to read just one page that I've cobbled together that I think will give us good context for the action, and we'll go from there. And you know, the book is organized with one voice following another, voices ping-ponging off of each other. And I think it's about 69 folks that are actually in the book itself from all the interviews I did. And I know there's something of a challenge too, to keep track of all those voices and all those identities. And in some ways, that's a very important thing to do. And on the other hand, all of the voices come together on their own and make a certain music. And at some point, they tell the story seamlessly. So I'm going to read this page and not necessarily acknowledge all of the voices, but you'll just hear the chorus as they come together. The fight was over the World Trade Organization. The WTO, like many other international organizations, has always been about the acceptance of reduced sovereignty in the name of the common good. Something like, given the problems we all have, I accept we constrain my country's sovereignty in the name of global benefit. The WTO was there to move power from the local and national level into a set of global rules written by the world's largest corporations at the exclusion of civil society. That raises concerns for a lot of people. It was establishing the ability to supersede and effectively overrule what the nation state might do. So even if you won the legislative battle at home, you could be overridden at the global level. The rules being written were like, you can only have this much food safety. Anything higher is a trade barrier. Or this labeling system you have, it's an illegal trade barrier. Or you can't have this kind of investment rule. You can't have regulated services. All of it was viewed by the WTO as trade barriers. People didn't realize that under the rules of the WTO, it's illegal to ban products based on production methods. One of the only things you're allowed to ban is prison labor. But if you say, we don't want these products in our country because they're made under exploitive conditions, or because they're made in ways that damage the environment, it's actually illegal to say we don't want those products circulating in our country. We were telling people this in 1999, and they'd say, well, we should be able to decide those things. And we were saying, yeah, that's why we don't like the WTO. People were seeing the ways in which everybody was affected, no matter what issues were important to you, the environment, human rights, social justice, sweatshop issues. This unchecked globalization and trade was going to affect all of us. It was a battle of ideology. One was a vision of a single constitution for global corporate governance, which is what the first director of the WTO had said was necessary. The alternative was making trade rules for countries according to what was interesting to their people and their governments. Rules about what they would do when they decided to trade, not one-size-fits-all, top-down corporate dictates. You can learn from history that there has always been an element of confrontation, whether it's been labor strikes or civil rights sit-ins or the suffrage movement. You need to have a confrontation. We needed to have a massive confrontation, put our bodies on the line, and create a crisis. So that's the context, right? And I want to turn first question, open the floor to David Solnit, whose voice was the last voice we heard there. I know I wasn't going to say who said what, but David was the last voice we heard there. And I think one of the things, several things, I feel like this was just sort of a constant learning experience for me in terms of what was accomplished in Seattle. But one thing that stood out to me again and again, David, was just the size and the breadth of the coalition building that took place. So roughly 50,000 people, nobody has a sure number, but roughly 50,000 people, safe to say tens of thousands of people coming together, many of them focused on the goal of shutting down the WTO meeting. These protests took place over a week, and on the first day of the ministerial, they actually did you actually did shut down the proceedings and reach the larger goal of the meetings ending without a new agreement, right? And I have to say that, I don't know if there's another protest in the last 50 years. I think you have to go back to the civil rights movement, but another protest in the last 50 years of this scale that set a goal for itself on this scale and reached that goal. And it did so with environmental organizers working alongside union members, anarchists marching alongside priests, farmers and students, a massive coalition, right? So many entry points for getting in, for caring about the protests and for being involved. And on the one hand, that sounds really exciting, but on the other hand, it sounds like a lot to corral. And so I wonder, David, talk to us. How did that happen? Setting the goal and reaching it. How did that happen? And I ask you that in specific terms. I'd love for you to talk to people about what the organizing looked like structurally, energetically, how you went about organizing.
Thank you so much, DW, and thank you, Peter and City Lights, for hosting us, and very grateful to share space with Celia and Four Waters over here on Lijan Ohlone land in the East Bay, and wonderful to see many of my comrades that I have passed and recently run in the streets with on the Zoom. That's a big question. I think a lot of parts of the movement recognized that we needed a big confrontation, and that and so early on, the Direct Action Network started to form from networks of activists up and down the Western U.S. and discussed doing mass disobedience and street theater, and pretty early on set the goal of a shutdown. And and the thought was to have a clear, winnable goal, and also with the logic that people have been trying to influence and have their voices heard by the WTO, and they've been shut out, so that it was about to make decisions about all the things that matter in our lives. So it was up to us to actually stop them. And but in terms of the way it was organized, and others can speak to that, but there were a lot of layers of different organization. But the Direct Action Network called for mass nonviolent direct action and borrowed on the tradition of affinity groups, small groups of 10 to 20 people that came to us from the Spanish workers movement and anarchist movement. The Iberian Anarchist Federation organized themselves into churchilas, or grupos de afinidad, and so we borrowed that from the anti-nuclear movement, and more recent. But the great thing about affinity groups is everyone becomes an organizer. You organize your friends or your people in your workplace or your neighborhood, and and it allows autonomy, that you make some basic agreements about, here's our strategy, here's some agreements, but then beyond that, you don't have to be in each other's business, and you can do stuff in your own style and with your own politics. So that allowed a lot of diversity of folks to coexist. And then we, not always harmoniously, but I think, inspired by the Zapatistas, and we were connected to the global network, People's Global Action, that came out of the Zapatistas, that many of us see organizing more like an ecosystem. And so different parts of the movement play different roles. So the labor movement, the nonprofits, the teach-ins, the faith groups, the neighborhood groups all play different roles. And, and that if things go well, they complement rather than conflict with each other. I've been watching the protests of my friends in DC around Netanyahu. So I'm always trying to think, okay, what's useful that happened 25 years ago that we can draw from today? And so, I'm inspired watching people still organize ambitious mass actions around the crisis in Gaza, and around the climate crisis, and all the things that we were focused on that mostly got worse. And that's enough.
Well, and you said something that's really stayed with me when we spoke for the book. You said, often you just sort of describe what some people, I think the first word people might go to is decentralization, right? But you said often when people say decentralization, they mean disbursement, which I think is an interesting notion. And everyone said, we think, this is the best solution. We agree to this, right? And you talk about sort of more buy-in with this idea of disbursement. So it'd be interesting to hear you sort of just tack that on sort of this idea of disbursement, and maybe even a mention of the spokes council as a sort of companion to the affinity group model.
I mean, when people say decentralization or horizontal, they think it's scattered, but we were actually, part of the reason we won in the streets is because we were better organized than the police in the city, and that we were decentralized, but everyone in the streets had huge amounts of information. They understood the issues from going to all the teach-ins, and they could go toe to toe with a trade minister from wherever, and everybody knew what the strategy was. So you didn't need bosses or police chiefs telling you what to do, because everybody knew what the strategy was. So we were much, a web is much more resilient than a hierarchical stack of something that can easily get something knocked off, and then the rest of the parts don't know what to do. So we were a highly organized web, and that coordinated on so many levels, and that was more resilient than the dysfunctional hierarchies of the police departments.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just an anomaly of Seattle. I think that form of organization has often shown its resilience. Many of us in the Bay Area, a few years later, around the Iraq War, used a very similar strategy and were able to effectively shut down our own financial district the day after the U.S. invaded Iraq. So it wasn't just an anomaly or a surprise. It was actually good organizing.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Forwarders, I want to pivot to you because, you came to the action from a very specific point of view. You had been involved in the timber wars. And, I think sort of perhaps the fattest part of the book is the front section that describes all the work, the months and months of organizing and training that went on. And I would like to hear from you sort of about the importance of that training and actually how David sort of alluded to, about how some of it sort of moved in from other movements and some of the work that you had been doing with others in the timber wars. But yeah, talk about sort of the importance of training and what it looked like that as you all prepared for this week in November 1999.
Well, thank you, DW, and also thank you to City Lights. And I echo most of what David said very strongly. I think one of the reasons we were effective was because we had done a lot of training. So people came together really prepared. And the training happened in a lot of different ways. And just to back up a little bit for those who don't know what the timber wars were, in Humboldt County, there was a lot of cutting and clear cutting of old growth forests, and it became a real point of national protest, and people came from all over the country during the harvest period of time to put their bodies on the line and protect the trees. And in order to do that, you have to be trained, because you have to know what you're going into. If you're planning to be arrested, you have to know how to behave when you're in a situation that's frightening or feels confrontational or feels like you're vulnerable, which are places that we don't generally spend time or we generally intentionally avoid. So knowing how to go into that place and come out of it or experience it as a place of power is a really important thing. I mean, it can be a place where for the first time you feel like you have agency and voice in a really difficult place to have impact. And I think that we brought in a lot of training from from the civil rights movement. We brought a lot of nonviolence training in. We brought a lot of training in from the independence movement in India. So there was a lot of experience and then a real commitment. And we spent a lot of days training before the WTO in a big giant warehouse, just masses of people, getting them through so they would be not intimidated by such a vulnerable place, but rather feel it as a place of empowerment and a place where they could experience joy. And I would like to say that one of the most amazing things, and I think David was a huge part of this, was that it was fun. It was joyful. People dressed up as turtles, and, there was a lot of hostility and anger, and it was very emotionally intense, but there was also this tremendous joy in the streets. And I think people feeling a little more comfortable through the training allowed that joy to come through.
Yeah, I think that point is so important because, when we read about these, when we read about big protests or see images from them, often what we're given is the hot spots, right? The most fiery moments, right? In Seattle, it was a particular affinity group that decided to apply vandalism and smash some windows, and so many newspapers carried those images, and it became a different narrative, right? But there were these other things there too, right? All these different approaches, and this I think it's worth going into the detail of it, the sort of structure of the organizing that David was talking about, where you, as I understood it, you had up in that big warehouse you described, which everyone affectionately called the Convergence Center, a big map of the city of Seattle divided up into 13 pie wedges, which sort of included, a set of intersections, and the affinity groups were responsible for blocking those pie wedges, as it were, right? But they were left, as David said, to do it however they'd like to do it, right? So there was such a diversity of tactics. And David, if I could come back to you just briefly, I think that you were, as Four Waters alluded to just then, one of the individuals, and there were others, bringing that diversity of tactics. So, but talk about it. I mean, I think everyone knows about sort of lock boxes, people that were blocking intersections using piping that brought their arms together so that they couldn't be separated without saws or serious maneuvering. And that got a lot of the attention too. But there were other tactics that she's alluded to. Talk to me about sort of the importance of that diversity, the importance of bringing art and culture to the tactics.
When we called for the shutdown, we also called for a festival of resistance. And, I think, sort of with an emergent intelligence like a flock of birds, a lot of us were looking for how to rethink how we protest and how we organize movements. And so there was a lot of desire to experiment and use art and culture and, take a step back from the way protests had maybe been done before. So there was, I like to brag that a lot the arts organizing using art and theater and puppetry sort of was baked into the organizing from the ground floor and heavily influenced it, and that's how, Celia can say more about it, but I believe that's how humans understand the world, is through stories, and and the best way to tell stories is through the arts. So we partnered that with mass nonviolent direct action, and I think each pie slice was taken by a group of affinity groups called a cluster, and then it was up to them how they were going to shut it down. And so while we realized we couldn't get thousands of people to shut down the city and have it be sneaky, so we were very open and transparent. It was on the front page of the newspapers that we were going to shut it down at 7 a.m. that morning and have 2 marches. But only those groups knew themselves, and sometimes they didn't even know until the morning exactly how they were going to do that and at what time and where they were going to deploy from a march or show up from, out of the sky. So that created a lot of an element of surprise, and also just as I said earlier, people were super self-organized, so we were very resilient when things started to happen. People were able to make decisions and flow.
Yeah. Well, Celia, speaking of how people feel heard in the world, there were so many things about Seattle, so many reasons I think it's important, not just for its success, but it was a hash mark in so many ways. It was the first time you really, in the U.S. context, see the internet as an organizing tool, albeit a very rudimentary internet. It's where we see confrontation with the militarization of the police department, again, in the U.S. context, right? People's microphone, call and response, right? So many things came out of Seattle, and one of them was the Independent Media Center. And I think this is one of the big parts of what was accomplished there. And it'd be great to hear you talk about what it was and the role you played there in terms of trying to sort of yoke two worlds, if you will.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and just really want to appreciate City Lights for bringing us together and having this conversation. There's a couple things, I think it can be hard, even if we were old enough to remember when phones didn't have cameras and devices to communicate, many different apps to communicate to thousands and with thousands of people, chosen and people who find our stuff. Before that, even if we were old enough to remember before this time, it's hard now, I think, to really to conceptualize the moment that we were in then. And we were, in a way, we were experimenting with technology, with the internet, that is that large scale social communication, many to many instead of one to many, instead of three white guys by appointment, old white guys at 6 o'clock telling us what we should think is important. We had this ability to curate and share information with one another. There was also the ability to move video. And I feel like I'm talking about dinosaurs when I say this, but like this was huge. The idea that for the very first time, some very smart activists who literally had servers in their bedrooms that, amassing the computer technology to experiment with this, were giving everyday folks the ability to document something with a video camera. And of course, there were many steps involved. You had to get your hands on a video camera, then you had to get it off your camera and onto a computer and then onto the internet, and then people could see it. But still, that was something we didn't have. If you weren't a major news network or a big corporation with a PR firm, or, I remember Greenpeace is the only organization that I ever knew of that had a big media van and big cameras and could film their own actions. We were forced to experience the sort of twisted reality, twisted filtered reality of what we were doing in the streets on an ongoing basis for all these changes we wanted in the world through the lens of the corporate media that filtered and edited by them. Now, all of a sudden, a bunch of young people had literally developed the technology to begin to put that control into all of our hands. And, the words citizen journalism is the wrong phrase because we get into who's a citizen and who isn't, but community-powered media, community-powered journalism was something that we were in an experiment with. And that was before it was monetized, before it was corporatized, and before a couple of billionaires who are now meddling in our elections at in the tens of millions a day had control over that technology. This was brand new, and we were experimenting with it to be able to tell our own story. So not only was there the power and the agency that David and Four Waters were eloquently describing because of the organizing and the way that we were putting ourselves out into the streets, but we also now had a portal into telling our own story. We weren't relying on just community media or public access TV, college radio stations whose political views we could trust to tell a story for us. We suddenly now had a power and agency, and for a hot minute, we had that, and it was not commodified by corporations. It was not monetized. And that experiment was one of, that was one of the first times we got to play with that experiment in the streets during the WTO. And part of how that happened was that smart people who had developed that technology figured out how to create a space and create essentially a news institution that had dozens or hundreds of people with cameras shooting photographs, dozens and hundreds of people with video cameras taking video, people writing stories, people gathering audio, and then that being brought together and put out on the World Wide Web, which many people were just starting to have, access to in their lives. And it was a little bit curated, but for the most part, if you were anybody and you wanted to go out and tell a story, you could bring your equipment or borrow some equipment from the Independent Media Center, go out from a central space where everyone was working into the streets, document what was happening, and then come back and decide how you wanted to tell that story. You wrote your own headline. You decided what went up. You decided who you were going to interview. You found those activists from around the world who were affected on the front lines by unchecked, so-called free trade and neoliberalism. And you asked them the questions, and then you brought that back and you shared that. And your uncle in Poughkeepsie and your, grandma in Cincinnati and everybody everywhere around the world could see that. And that technology piloted in Seattle eventually spread around the world. And there were independent media centers everywhere using this new technology developed, by a handful of awesome coders who were trying to figure out how to do this, with a mission to advance the democratic experiment by the way we were able to communicate with one another and share info. And so it was a really precious time, because it was a time when that was much more pure than we experience it today. Yes, it's much more fancy and glossy, and there's a lot more people involved, but it's commodified and controlled now in a way that makes this almost unimaginable unless you experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah, and Forwarders, I'll put this question to you, and maybe all three of you can sort of think on it. But playing off of what Celia just said, it makes me think of two things. One is experience I had last spring on a college campus where I ran into a group of students who were there as part of protest, and they sort of looked a little bit lost, and I engaged them, and they explained that they were looking for some other folks that they had been talking with over Twitter. But they only realized that when they got there, they didn't know what they looked like, right? They didn't know who they were looking for. And David Taylor, who was a key organizer, chiefly with students back in 1999, has been organizing ever since. He said something to me when I talked to him for the book, and he said, Twitter killed organizing. And maybe that's a very blunt way of putting it, but I think he's sort of plugging into this idea that the technologies available to us now, that flashier sort of version of the internet that we're dealing with now, is perhaps a tool, but not a panacea. And I can't help but think about all of the importance of all the physical spaces back in 1999, the Convergence Center, the warehouses where trainings went on and people could get food and find a place to sleep. The Independent Media Center, it was a physical space. It was a physical space that was prepared to execute what Celia just described. There were live radio shows coming from the basement of a Methodist church, right? These physical spaces were so important. And somehow that hybrid seems so important between the two. And I wonder if you could talk about that, Forwarders, how you see it, how you see sort of, and maybe bringing it into sort of today's context, how we can best harness technology while still sort of holding on to the real world, so to speak.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. In my office, there are several young women, and we've had this conversation quite a bit about this schism that seems to be happening between younger people in this country and older people in this country. And I feel, or at least they express that they feel that they are looking at the world very differently through an entirely different lens than we're looking through. And it came really sharply into focus in the initial days of the Gaza invasion, because young people were saying this is not right, because through TikTok, they were getting frontline stories in the same way that Celia is articulating. We were able to get our story out. And in general, the older population was getting that curated, polished, shiny story that had been intended for whatever purpose it was intended. And so I think there's a place for both things. And the question is how to stay ahead of kind of that corporate capture. And I also believe that the space itself as a physical synergy created a physical synergy. And I saw in the comments from John that he came to the protests kind of not knowing what to do or having an experience. He thought he was going to look one way and ended up changing another way. I actually had someone who was a childhood friend show up at the warehouse. Unbeknownst to me, I just looked up at the warehouse and there she was. And it was a place that you could show up without knowing what the next steps were and figure out what the next steps are. And that's not something you can replicate digitally, I don't believe. You can have systems to kind of replicate it, but I don't think you replicate the warmth, the fact that people could eat together, the fact that there were puppets up against the wall, there were things here, there were trainings going on here. You can't replicate that in digital space. And so there was an energy and a synergy that comes with having physical location that someone who doesn't know what they're doing, doesn't know, this speaks to them, but they don't know how to fit in because they've never done it before. This gave them an access point that isn't as available with digital, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I really took to heart this idea that there are different lenses, and those different lenses present very, very different pictures and inspire very different reactions.
Yeah, and Celia, going back to you, because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about communications. I wonder, how you see the importance of sort of gathering in a physical space, and what it brings to the table versus all of the organizing and communication we can do online. What if anything, in your view, is sort of gained by that experience of sharing physical space?
Well, we're humans. We crave connection. That's part of our way as animals. We're pack animals. And there's also this idea that everything moves at the speed of trust, right? And it's really different to establish trust in a sort of vacuous space where you don't have visual cues and expressions and vocal intonation and to go off of. So I think that's a big part of this. And, going back to what David mentioned about this idea that a healthy movement is like a healthy ecosystem, it's marked by diversity. And I think that, there's something here that was happening about intergenerational organizing that was really important. There was an opportunity for people to mix where there were folks who were new and folks who were seasoned. There were so many ways to bridge and create belonging across what otherwise could feel like a chasm when you don't have relationship building in real time with real humans and a chance to get to know them. You talked about connecting over food. I mean, and that's a kind of a classic thing that, again, was like, this is us as animals. Like, you share nourishment and sustenance together, and that's a powerful thing, And I think that the inside outside game, which I'm sure that we'll talk about, it's often talked about as being important, but it's also oftentimes it's like really reductionist the way people talk about it. Oh, there was the lobbyists and the inside policy wonks, and then there was the street heat and the protesters. But there was so much more to that complexity, and those folks were coming to the convergent space. We were going to where they were. There was so much mixing that was happening across people who were having different lived experiences. And so, people who happen to have the privilege to and the education or whatever they needed to be able to follow the meetings and the bureaucracy and the policy, had the badges that puts them inside certain spaces where they could listen and digest and then help and illuminate. Those are some of the people we think of as those inside people. But they're, in a way, they're people who are, they're synthesizers, curators, they're meaning makers, right? And then they would come out and talk to us. And a lot of times the outside, was people who were directly impacted or stood to be directly impacted by these things. And it wasn't just those folks who were protesting, but it was folks who were going to write letters, who were going to call their congresspeople, who were going to apply political pressure by choosing to engage in electoral politics, and it was this huge array. And there wasn't a stigma around intergenerational organizing or organizing across different tactics. People had respect for each other. I feel like we're living in this world now where there's there's this idea that one generation hates another, and the boomers have something against Gen Z and vice versa. And I think there are a lot of these like narratives that we need to challenge because they're control mythologies that will keep us from one another when what we want to do is bridge and connect and be with one another. And I think the same thing is true about, people who vote or don't vote, and people who vote because they're all in on the electoral process, or people who vote because they actually want to try to intervene and do the best at voting for who they think has a chance to be the least likely to be awful, while we're in this interim strategy moving towards that other world that we all talked about being possible, which may be a world beyond the way we organize ourselves now in terms of governments and what have you. But I think that what was missing then was that I'm concerned about, that I see now, is this bifurcation, or this distinction and disconnect. And I wonder how we get past it. And I find, at least regionally, I live in a little teeny purple corner of a rural red state, and the only way that I can imagine that we get past this is connection. When I go to a seed swap, when I go to a meeting about how to keep my well working, when I go to a meeting about, what's going on in my county, that's the places where I meet people who I otherwise will never run into, and in those places, they get to taste my dessert. I get to take a bite of their casserole. We break bread and we talk about things, and we figure out where we have common ground. And we find a way to stomach the places where we don't have common ground, so that we can get stuff done to push against these systems that are unjust. So I don't know that I even answered your question, but
No, that was fantastic. And I think that so often we can feel so overwhelmed by the world, things out of our hands, global politics, climate change. But I think the more you can zero in on what the people across the street, or down at the library, or the church, or wherever you're going to school, what they're thinking and feeling, I think that's the best way to feel empowered, right? To feel like you can affect change in a very immediate way. And I think one component, you referenced sort of inside-outside game, and I remember something David said is, a lot of the union people, DC organizers, NGO players, these big, sort of politically connected organizations, they were all saying, oh, we wanted a seat at the table. And David said, well, we were saying, well, let's turn over the table, right? But somehow these two things, even so, still found a way to work together. And sort of people that were on the inside of the delegation, of the ministerial, trying to affect the meetings, and using the street heat to sort of affect the meetings, that working together. But also education, right? Communication. It's like the old United Farm Workers adage of you educate to organize, you don't organize to educate, right? And there were, I know, months and months of teach-ins going on. And David, I know you even did a road show where you sort of went on the road with some folks and talked about what was going to be happening in Seattle. And maybe just talk, David, about the importance of that, sort of that communication and education, and giving people time to come around to understand the points that matter to you.
Yeah, and I think we were different animals in the ecosystem, but there was definitely some tension and conflict, between labor, nonprofits, and the Direct Action Network was the bad protesters until the Black Bloc showed up, and then they got to take the mantle from the other parts of the movement that, until November 30th, the Direct Action Network was looked at negatively by a lot of labor and a lot of the larger nonprofits. So there was definitely conflict. And to be blunt, grassroots radicals out-organized, in many ways, big labor and the nonprofits, in terms of we had a large, well-organized confrontation that made sense to a lot of people and pulled people in, and they had a march that was marching in a circle. But we did, that was our collective art and revolution did a tour around the West Coast, and we included two folks who told their stories. Chi Abad, who was a sweatshop worker from Saipan, who lives in the Bay Area and wonderfully was included in the book, and David Reed, who was a lockout steel worker from Spokane. And we told the story, basically broke down the economics of corporate globalization using art, theater, music, puppets, and then also had these folks tell their actual stories fitting into it, and then followed the theater by doing direct action and street theater trainings. And so, and went all the way from the mid-coast of California up to Vancouver and Victoria, BC. And that, again, that face-to-face helped a lot.
Yeah, and I think one of the organizers toward the end of the book made the point that because of all that work, when it came around to the confrontations with the police that played out over the course of the week, that people who weren't involved in the protesting, just citizens of Seattle, sort of understood what was happening because of the broadsheets, because of the teach-ins, because of the yard signs, all of these things. They understood what was happening, and they understood the role the police were playing in that moment, in those days. And I think that that's crucial.
To jump in 1 sec, I do think I see our role as organizers is to get people to rise up to intifada, and that what happened, it went from an organized resistance where a couple thousand of us who were in affinity groups and had been to trainings and were connected to meetings, all of a sudden was joined by people who had no organizational connection. They had heard about it, they'd read about it in the newspaper, they knew to show up at 7 a.m. And because we had done a good job laying out, here's what we're doing, here's why, tons of ordinary people. And there were also, thanks to a Sature, Filipino organizer who catalyzed neighborhood groups, tons of people from the community came and just joined in. And where I was, people were physically linking arms and keeping the delegates out. And it was initially it was affinity groups, but eventually it was like hundreds of ordinary people who showed up, and we plugged them in, and they, physically shut it down. So I feel like that's, in a microcosm, what we have to do is make a good case, have ways for people to plug in, and have a clear logic for it, and the infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, I'd love to pile on that just for a minute, if I may. I think one of the points that I want to make is that in addition to the Indie Media Center and this new technology to tell our own stories, we also held our nose and put on our wading boots and interacted with corporate media. And we got a lot of really good results with that. And for every affinity group that was out there, anarchist soccer, clowns, people singing, people doing morning exercise, people, locked down in all sorts of different soft and hard blockades is some of the language, but each of those folks had an option, if they wanted, to have a reporter join them in their little chunk on the pie wedge. If they wanted to, there was a press release waiting for them. And if somebody in their group wanted to give us a call and let us know what was happening at the Indie Media Center the morning of, we would, treat them just like the nonprofit organizations and the corporations were being treated, where they had their own little PR firm. And so, a group of folks who had come on, together in a carpool from a certain place, no matter what they were doing, if they wanted to, there would be a press release that would go out saying where they were, why they were there, what from their community was going, their concerns were, how they would be impacted directly by these unjust policies and these decisions being made by these corporate tribunal lawyers, that were going to undo all of the policies of their, local, regional, and national governments. And if they wanted to, they could put in a quote. And if they wanted to, they could have reporters meet up with them. And we elevated direct action and civil disobedience. We elevated activism and elevated the affinity groups. If they wanted to deal with corporate media, they could. And all of a sudden, they had the same clout as big green groups, as DC Beltway organizations who, had media lists and were sending things out to reporters. And I do think that changed things too. And, we had a lot of shift during the week between how things were spoken about on Monday or Tuesday and how people regarded and were speaking to the activists we're talking about who took to the streets by the end of the week. And yes, a lot of things happened after that, and some of that history, sadly, was rewritten, and we maybe, lost control of some of the narrative of that in 2000 and by 2001. But for a couple of weeks there, and particularly even through the end of 1999 and into early 2000, if I think, we, beyond maybe the stories about Y2K, which kind of swept us out, we had a huge comet's tail, and that dynamic, that, the work that we had done, and this was a bunch of us who were Direct Action Network media volunteers, but also a lot of those people were folks who worked in PR firms, worked for nonprofits, and they just came in and said, yeah, I'm going to volunteer my time because I know how to work the phones and call reporters. And they said, yeah, these folks, no matter what brought them to this place, they deserve to have their demonstration, their little slice of the pie elevated if they wanted to. And I think that played a role also. And that's not something that a lot of grassroots, particularly grassroots groups that choose civil disobedience and direct action and other types of tactics like that have usually have an honor or privilege to have. And so that leveled the playing field. And I think that also, David, allowed us to outplay some of the nonprofits because we had really cool stuff we were doing, and the media knew about it, and we were telling our own story about it. So it was a groovy trifecta there.
Yeah. Yeah, David.
Just one thing that Celia did from the IMC is I was arrested the second day and in jail for the rest of the week, but she would get people who wanted to interview organizers in jail, and I would call her, she would give me numbers, and then I would do collect calls where you'd have to say, this is direct action organizer in jail, and I would call the media, and then I was in jail with a Teamster organizer, a range of different people. So we were doing probably did a dozen jail interviews in the few days I was in that Celia was setting up.
Yeah, and also to give some love to others, I think it's Dennis Moynihan who talks about it in the book, that the media center phones were also used to allow folks that were in jail to organize with each other, for the folks in the women's side of the jail to organize with folks in the men's side of the jail, because they knew they had a number that they could call into. And so the media hotline sometimes served that purpose as well. But, and all of this, I have to say, was profound levels of organization. I also really refined and came up as a media activist doing work in the timber wars, both learning from and alongside Four Waters, who was doing jail support while I was doing media work in Humboldt County, but also connecting with and learning from folks all over the country who, in response to the salvage logging rider and the brutal destruction of public forest land at the hands of the federal government, had organized in old growth forests and ancient forests all across the land where we have it in this nation, the lower 48. And so there was so much finessing and learning. How do you get through to the corporate media system? And there were a lot of tools and tactics and round that, I want to give a huge shout out to everybody who was a bike messenger in Seattle. We had hundreds of people who just showed up and said, hey, I'm a bike messenger. I took the day off. I know this town. We've all got walkie-talkies. We've got our own communications. We got bags. We got bikes. What can we do? And so, we would know that there were people who needed to get their footage out, but keep shooting. And we wanted to have tapes, audio and video tapes being delivered as fast as we could. And it was bike messengers who otherwise had jobs delivering things for banks and corporations, who just came out of the woodwork, organized themselves, and then came to us and said, how could we help? And that's one example. I think there's probably dozens of different types of folks from walks of life in Seattle who came together and made this happen. Because it was a huge overreach, because no matter what you cared about, if you want to drink water, if you want to eat food, if you care about clean air, if you care about your kids' health, this crazy plan was going to ruin everybody's life, everybody's quality of life. It was just such a miscalculation and overstep by, the government and corporations, that they pissed everybody off. And that's probably the biggest mistake they made, was to think that they could actually do what they were saying they were going to do.
Yeah. Definitely caught flat-footed, WTO and the city of Seattle and everything in between. And I have to say, I think we're going to shift to Q&A here. I see Peter rejoining us, but just to put a sort of a one thought on what you've all been saying here at the end of our conversation about the relationship between these different organizing traditions and groups and individuals. Particularly the sort of divide between the Direct Action Network and DC connected groups. One of the most gratifying parts of the book, from my perspective, is where you have people like Mike Dolan and Lori Wallach, who are coming from DC, who are working for Ralph Nader, who are sort of the epitome of DC connections, making the admission in the book, the gleeful admission, that they were wrong. Lori Wallach says that. She says, I had no idea this could happen. The Direct Action Network kept saying they could shut down the meeting, did not even think that was possible, the United States of America. And they made it happen, and they shocked me and shocked the world in many ways. And I think it's very gratifying for that arm of the effort to come around to that reality. And I think she talked about how it's really changed the work she's done since then. So I think I'm going to switch over to Q&A, and I wanted to sort of just take a minute, if I may, before we do that, to address something that I think redounds to the conversation we've been having about big tent coalitions, how we build them, right? Pat Buchanan was in Seattle, and so was Tom Hayden, right? It was kind of unfathomable, the breadth of interest and people that were there and all of the disagreements that were there. But somehow people were able to still come together on this goal of shutting down the meeting. And I know that big coalition building isn't always easy. I know this. And in fact, I know it involves a lot of disagreements and contradictions. And I want to go into one real-time example. I think it's what is with us even in the chat room as we've been having this discussion. And I think it's meaningful to touch on for many people in the audience. It has to do with one of the interviewees, Suzanne Savoy. She was part of the group that we've alluded to that organized as the Black Bloc, which used vandalism to make their voices heard. That was one of the tactics they employed in Seattle. And the group was small, as we alluded to, by most estimates, no more than 50, and in many ways stood in opposition to the 50,000 people who were there committed to nonviolence, right? A very different tack that they took. And after WTO, Suzanne went on to organize with the Earth Liberation Front, which engaged in many different tactics and ran them afoul of the law by engaging in arson. And the U.S. government came down by all measures in a completely inhumane and over-the-top way to go after the individuals who had been working in the Earth Liberation Front. And many individuals were incarcerated because of the federal government coming down on that action so hard. And Suzanne was one of those individuals who was incarcerated. She was incarcerated for a short while because she cooperated with federal authorities. And she gave information to federal authorities, which meant that other people went to prison for a much longer time. And all of this, by the way, is detailed in a fantastic documentary called If a Tree Falls, nominated for Academy Award. And I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, I imagine many people have seen it, but please check it out. It's a really, really important film. And most importantly, I know that there are people from the Earth Liberation Front joining us for this event who did not cooperate with authorities, like Suzanne did. And by not cooperating with authorities, they served longer sentences. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Daniel McGowan, who I think is with us. I'm not sure. I think he might be. But I know Daniel spent 7 years in jail. I have not spent a day in jail in my life. Daniel spent 7 years in jail, and several others spent time in jail. One of Daniel's co-organizers, a gentleman named William C. Rogers, he ended his life in jail as a result of this. And I think he left behind a moving note that I think deserves to be shared, that was made public. And he wrote when he ended his life, "To my friends and supporters, to help make them make sense of all these events that have happened so quickly, certain human cultures have been waging war against the earth for millennia. I choose to fight on the side of bears, mountain lions, skunks, bats, cliff roads, and all wild things. I am just the most recent casualty to the war, but tonight I have made a jailbreak. I'm returning home to earth, to the place of my origins." He wrote that on 12/21/05. So all this played out years after the context of the book and the WTO protests that is the focus of the book, but I think it deserves to be acknowledged because I know this dynamic is there. I think it's important to acknowledge the over-the-top incarceration that Bill and Daniel and others endured. And I want to acknowledge that I know Daniel is upset at the sight of Susan's name, and he's expressed his wish to not have her voice in public. And I respect that wish. I really do. Even if I don't share that wish, I respect that wish. And I hope that we can come away from this conversation with every effort possible to make the tent as big as we can and to take inspiration from Seattle and how big the tent became there with all the disagreements and with all of the contradictions. And if Daniel is with us, I would like to, Peter, if it's possible, he's not with us. Okay. So I hope he hears that message, and I'll find another way to get that message to him. But I think it was important to say that. And yeah, I know that there are a lot of complicated relationships and complicated individuals in the story, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Peter, do you have any good starting points for us there in the?
Let's see. James says, please speak about Alex Cockburn's column about the protest, his criticism of Big Labor's alleged role in the ensuing nasty exchange with Medea's then husband, Kevin Donaher.
Yeah, so, and I have Cockburn's book behind me, actually. It's a fantastic book that he put out shortly after the protest. So they really have a sort of the moment feel of the action. And I think that, yeah, labor, it was interesting. And you want to talk about sort of the disbursement that David and all of us have been talking about, sort of this horizontal organizing. In many ways, labor came in and really in their own way sort of disrupted that, right? They brought a very hierarchical approach. There was an alliance built between steel workers and environmental groups, and they worked together. And I talked to two of the lead organizers there, Don and Tracy was working with some of the environmentalists, and Don was representing the steel workers, and they have a meeting and they would break apart into their cohorts to make some decisions. And Don said, it always took about 5 minutes for us to make decisions. And Tracy said, I often left before we made any decisions. I got tired. So you have very different organizing styles, right? And labor was very divided in terms of their commitment to shutting down the WTO. In fact, much of the leadership in labor, John Sweeney in particular, AFL-CIO, who's no longer with us, other leadership was not keen at all on joining the efforts of the Direct Action Network in sitting down in the streets and blocking the intersections. And you had a major confrontation that Danaher and some others drove, where after labor had a big meeting, a big rally at Memorial Stadium, representing numbers-wise the biggest cohort of the protest. They were coming down all these streets, right, toward the action, toward the convention center where all the action was. And Danaher and Mike Dole and others described seeing that, and it felt like the cavalry was coming to give reinforcements. But then they saw them peeling off, right? And there was a big schism there. And Danaher and others sort of ran ahead and made efforts to get some of the rank and file to join the Direct Action Network and sitting down. And in fact, a lot of the rank and file of labor did in fact do that, but without their leadership. And Danaher tells a great story about after these protests, meeting with Sweeney in DC, and he came around like Lori Wallach, and he said to Danaher, you were right, you guys did it, and I'm ready to sit down in the streets, I'm ready to do it. And they were planning new actions for the coming months. But then, of course, 9/11 came along, and that snuffed out any interest that Sweeney and other similar leadership had in taking such direct action. So I think it's a really important part of the narrative. And I think, for me, an important takeaway there, too, is the rank and file sort of taking their own initiative against the leadership's wishes. I think that was really important.
We have another comment. This is by John. The organizers of WTO also did a great job creating an on-the-fly training infrastructure at the 420 Denny Convergence Center for people like myself who showed up 1 week before the big day, not thinking I was going to join the lockdowns, but changed my mind after going through a training led by Lisa Fithian.
Yeah. I would love to hear one of you, Celia or Four Waters, David, talk about that. Talk about sort of even that environment. And I will say one thing that Lisa said was, a lot of organizing today is about culture of identity. And she said right then it was a culture of care, right? We wanted to care for each other. But yeah, any color you might add to that comment, I would welcome from any of the three of you.
No, it was just nice to hear his comment. I think that it goes back to that thing that we created a space that you could walk into that room and be uncertain and find an accessible pathway. And even if you didn't want to be arrested, you could find a way to do something that felt like you were engaged and part of the experience, and your voice was part of the experience, and still be empowered. So yeah, it was a great space that way. I think a lot of people had that experience. So it was nice to hear the gentleman who said that. It was nice to hear that from him personally.
I am running through here trying to pull out comments.
Can I add a comment?
Yeah, please.
Just responding, Daniel McGowan reached out to me a couple days ago and raised the issue of Susan Savoy being in here. And my understanding is that what the concern, part of the concern is trying to create some repercussions when people turn on their comrades and that led to a lot of people going to jail, and that to not allow them to be in movement spaces makes it safer for organizers and activists in future generations to create a culture like a lot of movements have, where you don't talk to the feds or the FBI. And I guess I'm interested in honing in on, given that the book is out, and for folks on this Zoom call who are concerned, wondering what Mr. Gibson can do at this point now that the book's out. And I guess two things that come to my mind would be, you added the context in your comment. I wonder about adding that context on your website and maybe on the next edition of the book.
Yeah, I think so. It's something to give thought to. And you know, I worked very hard to stay out of the way in this book. I offered no original text of my own, right? I that was with great intention, because I wanted to let everyone tell the story. And really the only text I provide are in the briefest of bios of people in the back. And that could be a place that I make sure there's a note in future editions. I do think I just want to, I'm happy to do that. And that's full stop. I also, at the same time, want to acknowledge that, man, there are a lot of complicated people in this book. There are a lot of complicated people in this book that I don't personally admire and that I had a hard time talking with, interviewing law enforcement officials and so forth. But it's vital, I thought, to get their perspective. And people who shared stories with me of things they have done in their past unrelated to WTO that they regretted. And so it does introduce a little bit of a squishy line in terms of what telling 69 people's biographies. So that sort of is one concern of mine, but that coexists with an acknowledgement that, yeah, absolutely. Clearly, this has been a concern for so many valued organizers and people that bring blood, sweat, and tears to the work, and I want to honor that. So I'd be happy to do that. And another opportunity for me is I'm, you know, always talking to editors at newspapers and magazines, trying to find ways to introduce more to the conversation around WTO, especially as we get to November. I anticipate and hope to have opportunities to do some essays that expand on what's in the book. And this would be probably the first place I'd love to start. And if Daniel was open to it and others, oh man, I'd love to engage them and get their perspective and bring it into that essay. Again, you know, acknowledging that none of this touches on the breadth of the book this week in Seattle, right, and WTO protests, but understanding that this conversation fits into a bigger arc of organizing across generations and across movements. So I'm going to look for those opportunities, and if editors give me those opportunities, I'm going to seize them. And if Daniel and others who are involved are willing to engage me, I would be thrilled to do that and honored to do that.
Thank you for that. There's a comment about that you could do it sooner in the ebook, and also thank you for inviting Daniel to speak tonight and for letting me put you two in direct contact so you can have a conversation.
Great.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. How about we end it with James? Where are we now on corporate-dominated global trade agreements?
Yeah. I mean, I'll let others chime in on this, but I will say this, that there's you know, the WTO really was blunted in 1999. They really had high ambitions for what they wanted to do. When Pascal Lamy, the EU Trade Commissioner who became the Director General, the ambition was breathtaking, and they weren't able to do it. They haven't been able to do much of it in the 25 years since. And the WTO has been weakened in many ways, and U.S. administrations, for different reasons, have really not brought the support that, let's say, Bill Clinton was bringing to the WTO. All of that said, unfortunately, corporate governance has continued to swell, right? And I think that's much more about democracy shrinking and its responsibility to stand up to capitalism. And I think that that's a matter of our political leadership and the political environment we're in, and if we can affect change there. And maybe that's four waters. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you are directly involved in politics, and I wonder if you have a take on sort of where we are now with corporate governance.
Well, I think this is a big conversation, and one of my clients actually is looking at a national organizing strategy for wealth and equity in general, which is an extraordinarily big conversation and super complex. And everybody sees this through a different lens. Celia mentioned the whole silo thing. It's hard to approach something so big and complex without approaching it through a narrow lens. So I think our question is, how do we build a foundation? And this is something that Celia touched on quite a lot. How do we build a foundation that allows people and invites people and makes it possible for people to participate in a foundational movement through their own lens, using their own tools with their own understanding? And this is extremely difficult. I've been thinking about it a lot for the last couple of years because we're building this strategy and it's difficult. But I also think that we're kind of at a crisis point where very few people in the world make most of the decisions that impact almost everybody else in the world. And it's at a level that is astonishing. I think if people really unpacked it, it feels daunting and overwhelming and like you are a very small voice in a very big wilderness. And our challenge is to bring those voices together and make them the much larger voice. But to do that, we have to find some ways to make those spaces that Celia was talking about and bring a level of accessibility, I think, that is not prevalent right now. There are a lot of walls and a lot of they do and they don't, and I will and I won't. And we have to look at this like a fishnet. Everybody's going to have a different knot. And if the knots don't hold, there's holes, but not all the knots are going to look alike. Some are going to be far out. Some are going to be close. Some are going to be political. Some are going to be direct action. And we have to figure out how to accept that and make that movement possible.
I love that you spoke about fishnets for waters, because just to kind of come into what's happening in the moment. Yeah, well, it's interesting because fisheries is one of the areas where the WTO was able to advance their agenda and some of their trade facilitation stuff. But almost everything else that we were working on stopping back then still hasn't concluded. You know, the coalition Our World Is Not for Sale deserves a shout out. These are people, many of whom have been working on the WTO issues since 1999 and before, and they're still at it. In preparation for this, I checked in with some friends who are part of that network, who are in DC, in a couple of Asian countries, in South Africa and Mozambique, and just to see what they're working on. And, you know, they have said that one of the biggest things to know is that we were, you know, as we were trying to stop the big grab, the big monster broke itself into a lot of little pieces. And so now we have these bilateral and trilateral, or what they call plural lateral, you know, little conversations and little agreements that are sort of mini, you know, 4, 5, 6, 10 countries. And they're just doing all the same creepy stuff that we were trying to stop at the WTO, but they're doing it on smaller levels. That's one way sort of the monster, the zombie monster here is trying to perpetuate itself. You know, on things that are really crucial, particularly around technology right now and around food and fisheries, water, things that are really vital. The fight is on right now. Like literally, they are still fighting about whether or not creepy corporations are going to rewrite the rules of the global economy to bend to their will, or whether we, the people, are going to maintain the autonomy and the inherent civil and human rights that we have to create a joyful future for ourselves that is different. And so it's like we're in this moment, and the story is actually not finished yet. It's still untold, you know. And so they are one of a number of groups that you can get in touch with if you want to learn more, you know. And there may not be the same kind of festival of resistance or carnival against capitalism that's rising up, you know, but there are still ways that you can get involved. And the answer to this question is still untold. And the one big difference that I think we're all suffering under is back then we were telling talking about stories of the disappearing middle class and talking about how much a worker made per hour versus how much a corporate CEO makes per minute or per hour. And now those numbers are even more astronomical, and that division is even bigger, and that we've added lots and lots of zeros to that inequity. And so I think people are feeling the pinch more. And also part of the, again, the sort of shadow side of all this tech is there's a lot of things to be up in arms about, and far less time, in the day when we're taking care of our needs and getting our needs met. But there is still an opportunity. And one of, a couple actually of my favorite comrades from the streets of Seattle said, we'll win because we have more fun than them. We throw better, we'll win because we throw better parties. And I do feel like, going back to what Four Waters and David were saying, that is part of this, to not feel overwhelmed, to not let them, steal your joy, to not lose sight of our humanity and our human craving for connection in these times. But we got work to do. We got organizing to do. And there's a bunch of opportunities to do it, in your community and on the global scale.
Well, we have found ourselves at the top of the hour. I really would like to thank all of you for joining us and gracing our virtual halls tonight. Thank you, DW Gibson, and to all of our panelists, Celia Alario, Four Waters, and David Solnit. Our events are made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through our public events, our community outreach, our publishing program, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. Thank you again so much. Goodbye, everyone. Please take care, and we do hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.